Hi everyone, good evening. Thank you for joining us. It's a rainy evening in Mumbai here. I hope all of you are safe at your respective places, either at office or at home. So today we are going to discuss verbal prep for CAT 23. As the title suggests, ask us anything on CAT 23. So I hope you have already posted your questions to us. So for all the IMS students here, once again, good evening. We had asked you to post your questions. What we have done is we have gone through all the questions. I think we have received close to 100 questions. Uh, we have looked at all the similar content, and what we have done is we created a list of the 7 most commonly asked questions, right? So just to give a structure to our entire discussion, we are going to first discuss these 7 questions. Most of your questions, I'm sure, I'm confident that they'll be answered once you listen to the answers for these 7 questions. Joining us today is Kumud ma'am. I'm sure most of you have seen SimCAT videos or have joined us for a live online program, so are very familiar with Kumud ma'am. So thank you, Kumud ma'am. And also joining us today is Vijita ma'am. Again, people who have seen the SimCAT videos, have seen our concept videos, will be familiar with both these names. We are in for about 30 to 40 minutes of discussion. People watching us on YouTube, if you have questions, you can post it on the chat. We'll be monitoring the chat also. So before we start, what I'm going to do is to show you the list of all the 7 most common questions. So I would, request you to wait if you have questions that is already appearing on the screen, right? So maybe if, your question is how to identify the easy passages. So that question will be discussed as the first question. So I'm having all the 7 questions on the screen right now. So maybe you can, show a thumbs up on the chat box to tell us that your question, the one question that you wanted answered, is amongst the 7 questions. If it is not amongst the 7 questions, trust me, we'll be handling all those questions post we discuss the 7 questions, right? So there are questions on accuracy, there are questions about strategy, how many questions should I attempt? There are very, very specific questions about I have a particular issue with para-jumble. So we have tried to answer all these questions here. So without much ado, we'll get started. So I think the most common question, in fact, I would say this is the heart of RC strategy, which is the first question, which says, how do I identify the easy passages? So for the last 2 years, we have 4 passages appearing on the actual CAT. And we have only 40 minutes. There are 8 VA questions. So obviously there is a lot of content. Not everybody can read all the 24 questions and attempt those 24 questions. So people want to know how do I identify the easy passages? So Kumud ma'am, if you can take up this particular question.
Right. So first of all, what I normally hear from students is that a lot of times I start up with a passage which I think is easy, and then it turns out that the questions are really difficult. And on the other hand, the passage that I leave, it seems to have the easiest questions. Now, what I want you all to understand is that part of this is perception. There is a method that could probably help you optimize the right selection of passages and questions. It's a systematic method. I am going to give you a lot of detail. A lot of our IMS students might already be familiar with it, but it's always good to kind of go over it one more time. So what you're really supposed to do when you start the test is don't go in linear order, because then you may not have time to actually look at the easy questions. So please take a look at the section overall. You will see that, let's say there are 4 passages. Typically there are 4, but things can always change. There might be 5 as well. So whatever the case is, look at all the passages, and then you need to start allotting certain points to each passage based on 3 criteria. The first criterion is language. So for the most part, we would be able to judge whether the language is easy for us, okay, or normal, or maybe it's a little bit more complicated than what we are normally used to. So the rating system is pretty simple. Please assign 3 to the passage that you think is easy to read. I can read this and I can read this faster than my normal speed. So I will assign it a 3. Then you'll see a passage which you think, okay, this is something that I'm used to, but I might have to slow down a little bit, give it a 2. And after that, let's say you find a passage which is pretty complex and you know that you have to slow down for it. For that, I might give it a 1. So basically, the higher the point system, I'm so sorry. Just give me one moment, please. All right, so let me just continue with that. So higher the points, the easier the passage is to read, according to you, on the whole. Now, this is how we would probably look at the language. After that, let's look at the type of content that is there. Now, here, it's not very complicated. A lot of passages will simply have a lot of facts or information. We call these descriptive passages. Even if the topic is a little boring for these passages, you might find that there is really not much for you to process. Yes, there is a lot of data, but you should be able to read it pretty easily. So for this, again, I'm going to say, oh, this passage is primarily factual. Let me give it a 3. Then you might come to a passage which is not entirely factual. It might have a few arguments or opinions thrown in here and there. So I would give it a 2. And then you might have a passage which we call primarily argumentative, where the author states right at the beginning that I have a point of view. This is a passage that I might rate a little bit lower. I might give it a 1. So again, 3, 2, 1, 3 being the easiest in terms of content, 1 being the least or the most difficult. And then we come to the type of subject matter that you're reading. A lot of students actually assign a lot of weightage to the topic. For example, I am a science student. I'm okay with scientific passages. So, that's the one I'm going to do first. But what we need to understand is that just because you have a background does not mean that the passage and the questions are going to be easy. So yes, again, you can assign 4 to something that you're very interested in, 3 to something that you're not absolutely in love with, but you can read it. I mean, you're interested in it. 2 will be something that you can read. And then 1 will be something that you really don't want to read, and someone will have to kind of put a gun to your head to read that passage. So again, 4, 3, 2, 1. As you can see, the higher the points you assign, the easier it is for you in terms of either language, content, or topic. Now, at the end, let's say that you add up these points. Anything that has a score of above 7 is a solvable passage. So you should do it. It could be a 7.5, it could be an 8, it could just be 7 as well, right? But anything that scores below 7 points, that is probably something you should leave for later. So before I go to that passage, I'm probably going to look at the VA section first, see if I can identify a few scoring questions there, and then come back to this passage. It is also possible that the passage rates very low. Maybe it has a score of 3 or 4, in which case I might say this is not really a passage I want to do. And that's also fine. So this is the method that is something that we advise. Now, it does not have to take 5 minutes. You actually have to do this pretty quickly. Now, at the end of it, if you're still unable to decide, I would say write things down. That is the easiest way to do it. This entire thing can probably be done in about a minute and a half. So you're not really wasting time, and say, okay, passage 1 and 2 are the ones I'm going to do first. Then I will look at VA. The remaining passages don't have a very high score. So maybe I'll come back to it later or not do it. So that's all you need to do, really. Vijita ma'am, Hemang sir, anything you'd like to add to this?
I guess you have shared the core method, etc. So I think, see, the only thing I'd like to add is one needs to have confidence that out of the 4 passages, not all passages are equal. So there will be 2 passages which are relatively, let's say, simpler than the others. So the crux of the matter is, let's identify those relatively easy passages. On a good day, you have all 7s or all 8s, or on some days, most likely on the CAT, they will have a few 7, 8s, and others will be around 5 or 6. So once of the confidence that my job is to identify the 2 or the 3 easiest passages, I think we are good enough.
Also, if I may add here, please make this a practice during all of your solving, because that's important. That is the way in which you make the process of selection quick. Unless you practice that during your SimCATs or during your other, time-bound test solving, you don't really quicken your pace at selection. So yes, it has to be a process with you.
Okay. So let's move on to the second question. Okay, now this is a common, I think, complaint with students. So the complaint is people do read the entire passage and somehow they forget what is being read. So short-term memory loss issue, and they are unable to deal with the main idea and the summary questions that follow. So the question is obviously, how do we overcome this? Again, this I think is a persistent problem. So if one of you can throw light on the same.
Maybe I'll take this up. So this is something that happens to the best of us, the longer the passage, the more confused you are, the more complex the thought or more complex the passage and the idea development, the more confusing it is. And considering that we're dealing largely with analytical and argumentative passages, this is a genuine problem. So there are really no shortcuts here. Because retention is a challenge for each one of us. So what we normally recommend, and perhaps this is the only foolproof method that we can talk about, is looking at each paragraph and trying to filter the important idea of each paragraph as you're reading, which means that perhaps after you read that first paragraph, you pause momentarily, just for a second or 2-3 seconds and try to quickly sum up the important idea of that paragraph in your mind. What I personally do, and what I think a lot of us do, is also write down. But then, yes, I understand that the writing process can take a lot of time if you're already faced with the constraint of time. So you could perhaps, while you're revising this, because in your practice, definitely when you practiced RC, you did practice writing out each important idea of the paragraph, of each paragraph, and you had a thought flow developed. So perhaps eventually in time-bound tests, you can try to sum up that important idea in your head, note down a couple of keywords, as you're trying to summarize it in your mind, scribble, basically you're scribbling a couple of words, and that should have, that should give you some sort of a thought flow map that you can refer to. You already have the idea in your mind. And so as you connect the ideas paragraph wise, you have a thought flow developed, and therefore you have your perspectives right there. Okay, this should be done. I mean, ideally, I think in an ideal scenario, we'd always encourage you writing down the important points crisply, very crisply. You could even just pick the keywords and write them down. But if you think that writing out a sentence or so is a problem, scribble a couple of keywords, as you're summarizing the idea in your mind. That should enable you to have some perspective till the end of the paragraph. And when you go to questions, let's say if you're getting confused with something, you can always, refer to that thought flow that you have, those keywords for each paragraph that you have, you can refer to that, right? So this is what I'd suggest. If Kumuda has something to add to this, or if Hemang sir, any one of you, you could please go ahead and add.
Just a few things. So a lot of times, it's just a focus issue, right? So when we tell you that you should read every day, that is not only to build your vocabulary, it is also to build your focus. So if every day you're able to read for, let's say, about 45 minutes to an hour, and let's say if you're very short on time, maybe even half an hour, then you'll find that this problem also gets slightly better with time. And of course, whatever Vijita ma'am said is definitely helpful. In fact, when you start with RC, this is the method to start with RC. For a lot of people, it seems like a lot of hard work, right? And a lot of times students also say that I write down points, but my main idea doesn't really match the main idea that is there in the video, which is always possible because the way that I frame things may be different from the way that you frame something. As long as they are fundamentally capturing certain similar ideas, it's okay. And sometimes even if we have understood the passage differently, that is still okay. As long as at the end of it, you kind of know this is the topic and the author has a certain point of view about it. So what I'm trying to say is that just because you get it wrong a couple of times does not mean that you need to stop trying this method. All right, just persist with it. And in time, most students say that it is very, very helpful. It's a time-tested method.
Great. So I hope some of you will, in fact, all of you should go and, practice what has been said. my one bit, this is to do with our attention spans all around. So everything is becoming shorter, so people now can't watch a movie. They want to watch a series. They can't watch a series. They want to watch only Insta videos, reels. So everything around you is making your attention span shorter, whereas CAT is moving the opposite direction. They want you to be able to focus, for the entire duration of 2 hours. So the first thing you should do is when you study, ensure that you are challenging yourself for those 40 minutes. So if you study, 10 minutes of RC, it's very easy to maintain concentration. But when you have to stretch it to 40 minutes of concentration, that's where you will really build up stamina for the CAT. So we'll have to move away from the shorter versions of entertainment around us and focus on the longer versions of entertainment and reading. That should really help us. So it's more a habit rather than only CAT, I would say. Okay. So let's move on to the third one. Again, persistent question. Already the same question has been asked on the chat. So the question is how to improve my accuracy on RC, right? Maybe Kumud ma'am can start with these questions, and then Vijita ma'am can add. So a lot of people, I think Tirth Shah is being asked this question. So please pay attention, Tirth. This should help you.
So this is kind of a logical follow-up to the previous one. So when Vijita ma'am talked about pausing after every paragraph, that is very helpful. Now, there are two parts to improving your accuracy. One is comprehension, and second is option elimination. So sometimes the flaw is in both the areas. Sometimes you simply don't spend enough time comprehending the passage, and sometimes you have spent 5-6 minutes reading, you've written down your points, but when it comes to option elimination, you just don't believe in eliminating options. You think, oh, I think this is the answer, and then you select it. So selection is the worst possible way to arrive at an answer, not only for RC, but for other question types as well. So please ensure that when you're practicing, you come up with a reason to say option 1 is not the answer because, option 2 is not the answer because. Then let's say you like option 3, there's no reason to eliminate it. Option 4 also seems to be okay. Now you're stuck between two options. Stare at it for a while, refer back to the text, and see if you can find a reason to eliminate one of those options. So ultimately, comprehension in the first part is the first part, for which you need to do that pausing after paragraphs. At the end of it, see if you can at least mentally paraphrase what the passage is saying. Again, it doesn't have to be a detailed process. You can just write down a few words. And the second part simply is, please focus on elimination and not selection. And a lot of times, the person who creates the test, or the group of people who create the test, they know how your mind works. They will create option traps that will kind of, reach out to whatever is there within your mind and then get you to select the options that you're not supposed to select. So basically, you need to get rid of those mental biases and cobwebs, know that the options might be tricky, and therefore find a way to eliminate. So those are my 2 points. Apart from that, of course, there are so many mantras that are floating around. For example, some students say, should I read the questions first and then get to the passage? Honestly, from my perspective, you can take a look at the questions to kind of know how many questions there are, for example. Maybe you can also see if there is a main idea question or if the questions are detail-based. But it doesn't really help your accuracy if you really do that. So you will still have to read the passage. You will still have to go to the question. In order to answer questions, you might still have to come back to the text. So a lot of students say, I try to remember stuff, but when I have to eliminate options, I find that I have to reread parts of the passage. There's really nothing wrong with that. As long as you're not rereading the entire passage, it's okay. So at the beginning, just focus on accuracy. Don't focus on speed. There is still time. Vijita ma'am, I think I've spoken for too long and I might repeat myself. So
not at all. Every word uttered is a gem, definitely from the student perspective. I'd like to add another dimension here, which is the focus on analysis, because I always believe that, students come back and talk about the volume or the breadth of, solving that they do. They speak about, so many questions, so many RCs that I've done all along. But then, have I repeated the patterns, the incorrect patterns? Have I ever paused to correct those incorrect patterns that I'm repeatedly doing, right? Now that requires in-depth analysis. I am a firm believer of analysis, honest, introspective analysis. Now, this will involve a lot of things. First of all, coming to this notion of reading, that is, when I read the RC, how do I know if I'm reading accurately or not? Yes, in your practice RCs, you always have a reference, you always have some sort of solution given, or perhaps in a classroom, there is an explanation given. So you know that your understanding of the passage perhaps matches with the expected understanding, or when you get, let's say, a main idea correct, you know that you figured out the main idea. But then, are you sure that while reading, you don't make any gaps in your reading? Are you sure that there are no dots that your mind is automatically connecting? Because it happens to the best of readers that when you read, you tend to miss out on certain words here and there, certain phrases. Perhaps sometimes, that first sentence, half of the first sentence is omitted by us when we read. So am I reading the correct way? Is my mind really paying attention to every single detail and reading precisely? Because there can be a lot of gaps that we assume that my mind tries to fill in with its own assumptions, right? So then it doesn't become an accurate reading of the passage. It becomes a reading of the passage which is filled with some, connections that my mind has created, right? So that's the first step, I think. And that you can verify very often. If you think that you've got a lot of questions incorrect, you can always go back. That is after you're solving per se, after your solving time or so, you can always go back and reread the passage to verify if your first reading was really the correct reading, right? This involves time, which is where I say, if you're looking at solving 4 RCs, I would suggest that you solve 3 RCs and utilize that time instead on checking, analyzing where the gaps have been. So that's the first level, which is reading with precision and verifying if I've trained my mind really to read exactly everything, not may assume gaps and, fill those in. The second will have to do with, what is the analysis that you do post, let's say, solving an RC or post an RC sectional? Do I focus on, do I go back and check everything? Yes, perhaps most of us do that. So what do I identify? That I've misread the question, maybe that I've misread the option, perhaps. Now, this may be what we think usually, but quite often it could be that I have not comprehended the ideas correctly. So let's say I've marked a certain option when some other option was actually correct. All I have to do is go back to those lines, read those lines, and allow myself to process as to why I ended up marking perhaps, option B as my answer, whereas the correct answer is A. Why did I infer these things out of these lines? Now, what we're doing there is we are correcting the patterns of thought of our mind, the way in which we typically reason, correct? So that's another aspect to it. You can also, your analysis should also involve identifying strengths, whether it is strength in a certain type of language, and this is very much connected to the selection process that we are talking about, that we Kumud ma'am started with. So what are your strengths with regard to subjects, topics, with regard to question types as well? Some of us can be quite weak with inferences. Some of us can be quite weak with summary question types. So am I identifying these incorrect patterns? Am I looking at ways in which I can correct them by going back, rereading, analyzing, figuring out what exactly went wrong there, right? So these things are important. You will also, come this question of being confused between 2 options will also come up eventually. And I always believe that this again boils back to how well I have read those lines, that paragraph or that passage, because if I have not been reading correctly, if I missed on certain details, that is where that confusion comes in, okay? I would suggest in this effort to actually improve your accuracy on RC, I would suggest that you also keep a track of what is the outcome normally. So I get confused between 2 options and I end up marking one particular option. And I find that it's always incorrect, right? Or at least in most cases, you can't say it's always incorrect. In most cases, that guess or, that partly measured response, evaluated response ended up being incorrect, right? So what I will have to therefore learn or infer from that is that, okay, this is an error. This is a pattern with me. So let me start recognizing those times when I get confused between two options so that I can let go of that question, because I know that when I get caught between these two options, I invariably end up marking the incorrect one, right? Or perhaps it can be the other way around too, that even if I get caught between two options, I end up marking the correct one, right? So identify these patterns and these trends. So some good time spent, a good number of minutes that you spend on analyzing what you solve is just as important, if not to your solving of RCs, right? Simply solving RCs, targeting a 2 or 3 RCs every day without an analysis doesn't break the usual patterns of your thought or patterns of your reasoning, right? All right. Did I take a lot of time on that? I hope not.
It's all good.
Okay, so let's move on to the next one. So question 4. Okay. So the question is about the strategy. So what should I attempt first, VA or RC? So I think I will take a shot at this one first. So I would say we can tie it down to your time allocation strategy also. So we have 40 minutes for the verbal section. I'm assuming that the same CAT 22 pattern will continue for CAT 23 also. So within those 40 minutes, I would say start with the first rough allocation of 25 minutes to RC and 15 minutes to VA. Now, depending upon your own strengths and preferences, you can change it by about, let's say, 5 odd minutes. So, for example, if I think I'm good at RC, I would allocate, let's say, 30 minutes to RC and 10 minutes to VA. Okay. Typically, it happens to be about 25 to 28 minutes to RC and about 10 to 12 minutes for VA. Right. So that's the broad allocation. My suggestion is, when you're deciding how should I attempt VA first or RC first, always start with your strength. Also remember that VA is the first section of the CAT. So how do you start may impact your entire 2-hour attempt. So you should be off to your best performance. So in cricket, your best batsmen typically are the openers. So you should also open with your strength, I would say. So, for example, if I take up a SimCAT right now, I would like to start with RC because I believe I'm confident with my reading comprehension skills. No matter what type of an RC, I'll be able to do justice to it, right? So start with RC if you are confident of your RC skills. Some of you who think, okay, I do well at parajumbles or can start with parajumbles, right? So roughly decide 25, 28 minutes for RC and about 10, 12 minutes for VA. The second angle to look at here is, some of us need some warm up for our brains to start performing at the peak level. So some of us may not directly like to jump into a very dense RC. If you are such a person, then I would say you can start off with a parajumble. So your brain has those 3-4 minutes to get used to reading, getting used to what's happening on the screen, and then you can maybe proceed to an RC. I remember talking to Suneet during a YouTube live session last year where he was doing a live solving of a SimCAT, and he had a very interesting insight. He said that when he's staring at the screen before the verbal section starts, and verbal is not his forte is quant and LRDI, even though he scores 100 percentile every time here. What he said was he reads the instructions that are given on the screen multiple times so that his brain gets used to the concept of reading before he starts his verbal section. I thought it was a very nuanced, hint from a 100 percentiler. So maybe some of you whose brain needs some warming up can try his technique, that before your verbal section starts, read the instructions a couple of times so that your brain is now getting used to the concept of, reading. My final word on the same, that towards the end, so when you are solving an RC, you will need a good 10 to 12 minutes to do justice to an RC, because you have to read the entire passage, which should take about a couple of minutes, and then you will be solving the questions. So if you don't have about 10 or 12 minutes remaining with you, maybe entering a new RC may not do justice. So at that time, you should be focusing on the VA part of it. So before you start an RC, just have a look at the time remaining. If it is not enough time to do justice to an entire RC, that time should be spent on VA, right? Last bit to it. So I spoke about your strength. I spoke about needing time to warm up. The third part is, again, it is about your stamina. So for example, maybe ma'am can take 4 RCs at the same time, back to back after one another, because she is used to reading, right? Maybe somebody else might say, I can't read 4 RCs, dense RCs back to back. So they need a mental break in between. So I have seen students do this very successfully. They take up 2 passages, spend about 15 odd minutes there. Then they go back to 1 or 2 para-jumbles, slight break in terms of density, I would say, and then they go back to an RC. So final conclusion, whatever works for you should be adopted. My final request here is, whatever strategy you have should be tried, experimented, refined, and finalized during the SimCATs. There should absolutely be no surprises on the day of the CAT. So maybe SimCAT 6, you can say, or SimCAT 7, you can say that, look, I am going to do ABC. Let me see how it works. But by the time you reach, let's say, SimCAT number 14, 15, this year we're doing 18 SimCATs, proctored SimCATs. You should have a strategy that this is what I'm going to do on the day of the CAT. So we have 18 SimCATs for you to experiment, use them. You also have the take-home SimCATs, use them well, work out your strategy, and make sure on the day of the CAT, you have 2-3 scenarios that, okay, given this scenario, this is going to be my strategy. If there is an extreme change, I am going to change my strategy to strategy number 2, right? So that is my piece on VA first, RC first. Kumud ma'am, Vijita ma'am, if you like to add something.
This is with reference to maybe I can do 4 RCs. I'm actually a major fan of the VA, RC, VA sort of a system. So what you were talking about in terms of a mental warm-up, I think it is very helpful. So in fact, I do exactly what you just said. Because the para-jumbles are a risk-free option, it's a good idea to start with the para-jumbles. And then, it's whatever works for you. So it's not necessarily that just because you have spoken to, let's say, someone who's consistently scoring a 99.99 and they tell you, you know what, you should always start with RC. May work or may not work for you. So try out whatever it is. And as I said, this strategy of VA, RC, VA is something that I have arrived at over time. So you will figure out that sweet spot for yourself. But for that, again, please ensure you take the mock tests. That's pretty important.
Okay, let's move on to the 5th question. Vijita ma'am, you can take up this one. So it's about strategy of or the method to attempt a para-jumble, but very specifically, this is the query, heartfelt query by the student with a long paragraph. So he says, I can arrange 3 sentences of paragraph in a para-jumble, but I cannot just fit the 4th sentence. So maybe he's missing out on what has to be the opening statement, or what should be the conclusion, and how do we resolve this issue?
Well, in these days of 4-sentence para-jumbles, ever since CAT started giving you 4-sentence para-jumbles without the options, I think there have been a few things that, can be tricky for students. There is this one notion of, you can identify 2 mandatory pairs, but then you don't know which pair to start with, right? So let's say you might have seen that 1-3 is a connection, 4-2 is a connection, but should I start with the 4-2? Should I start with the 1-3? That's one problem, which I think can be resolved by trying to understand the author, the author of the paragraph, his intentions and his purpose there. If you can, try to look at both these pairs, the ideas that they are conveying, and try to figure out in terms of figuring out, what might be the intention of the writer here that might help you, right? So very often it could be you're talking of a problem and then there is some sort of solution, a cause or an effect, or some sort of context creator first, and then the actual argument or so, or opinion of the author could be some such thing. So it helps you to pay proper attention to what exactly is this paragraph trying to convey, or these pairs of sentences are trying to convey, right? And what is a more logical, sensible presentation, sequencing of them. So that's one problem, but that is really not as challenging as perhaps what is given here. There's yet another problem before I come to this, which is that idea of I find a mandatory pair, but then there is this clash between 2 sentences. I don't know how to order these last 2 sentences or 2 given sentences. I know that there is a mandatory pair, but then between those 2 sentences, which comes first and which comes later? I would say that other than reading those lines carefully, okay, They might be difficult for you because you've not seen any evident language connection in terms of perhaps a pronoun there or a repeated keyword or so, right? Which means you'll have to only read those sentences carefully to figure out what exactly are these sentences conveying? What is the idea, right? What is the context and what is the idea that these two ideas are creating? That can perhaps help you with figuring out how to order those two independent sentences that you couldn't really pair well, okay? The third and a major problem is what you see on your screen, which is you find a sequence, all right? And that's a very clear sequence because it links in terms of idea, in terms of keywords, or in terms of, all of those possible links that we talk about, noun, pronoun, or, the article linkage, etc., etc. So that sequence is clear. And then you have this very odd sentence, which seems to, could start the entire sequence or can end the entire sequence. And if you track past CAT patterns, you will find that that sentence can be of two types, basically, that one standalone sentence. Often, this sentence is perhaps an example or an explanation of the idea that the three sentences develop, right? So that sequence you established, perhaps 1, 2, 3 is a sequence, right? And there is this fourth sentence that you don't know whether this should be placed at the start or at the end. Now that sentence could be an example. So it doesn't necessarily contain any of the words or terms that are used in that other sequence, but it stands as an explication or an example of whatever is being discussed, which means as an example, you should necessarily come at the end. Another pattern that we've noticed is that that sentence can be just a context creator. And you have this actual sequence that you identified, perhaps a 2, 3, 4 sequence that you identified, being the actual development of thought. And you have a sentence which doesn't seem to have connections of language with the other 3 sentences, but in terms of setting the background or creating the context, it is relevant, right? So in such a case, you should be able to figure out that you should start with that because that's a context creator. It doesn't stand as an example of the idea in the other 3 sentences. Having said that, it's easier for us to talk about this theoretically. When it comes to application, it's always a challenge. You must practice reading sentences carefully, all right? I find that a superficial reading, which a lot of us tend to do, a superficial connecting of, keywords and terms here and there, without a detailed reading of those sentences and trying to, relate those sentences or the idea that develops to a larger perspective as to, what might be the author is trying, what could possibly the author be trying to say here, etc. That's important, don't focus on a superficial reading, focus instead on a very detailed reading and meaningful understanding of those sentences. Okay, that's at least the pattern of parajumbles that we've seen in the last few years. All right, so this is my 2 cents on this. Anyone wants to add, please go ahead.
I think we can move on to the next question. So this one is, what should be my daily stroke weekly practice schedule? So Vijita ma'am, would you like to take this one up?
Yeah, I will, yes. I think this has been much spoken of. We have our schedule, we've suggested different schedules during our group plans, my plan sessions, group mentoring sessions, several of the webinars. But, considering the time that we are in, which is August, we're setting into August, and, these months are supposed to be a focus largely on time-bound practice, which means that, let's say, so I'm assuming that you started your practice some time back, okay, with specific reference to verbal. As far as reading is concerned, you are able to comprehend RCs. You're at that stage. If you're able to comprehend RCs, then it is the stage for you to build your speed, which clearly means that you get into time-bound solving, correct? So test taking, any of the tests that we have, perhaps the BMTs that you haven't finished, or section tests, module tests, or your SimCATs, pre-SimCATs, the take-home SimCATs, or even the proctored SimCATs, right? I want to believe that the regularity of the proctored SimCATs is going to be every 2 weeks. Perhaps in the next month, it's going to be every week. That is in September. I think we have 4 SimCATs scheduled. About 10 days, one mock in 10 days for August, which means that, look, if I have a proctored SimCAT as part of my agenda, then yes, I can also plan any of the take-home SimCATs, which literally means I'm trying to, manage 2 SimCATs in a span of about 10 days or so. So that's one thing. Whatever else that I solve, let me make sure it is time bound, because this is the time when you should look at developing speed. And speed building can always happen, especially from the perspective of reading, can happen when I know where I stand with the usual minutes that I take for my reading. So how long do I take to read an RC usually? And perhaps I challenge myself with that time. So if I normally take a 6 minutes or 7 minutes or 10 minutes to read an RC, perhaps I reduce the time slightly and give myself less time. And, I keep building on that. So it could just mean 30 seconds less that I've given myself. I can perhaps I can practice that way for some time and then reduce further time. So it's very essential that you build on speed, but of course, never at the point of compromising your accuracy, right? So make sure you're looking at a 75 to 80% accuracy, and try to balance accuracy with the time that you take to read and solve. Okay, so time bound, which should largely be your general target. So let's break this down to what should be your everyday practice. Your everyday practice has always been what we recommended, which is 2 or 3 RCs to be done. I always encourage an early morning solving of the RCs, because I think that your understanding of an RC and therefore, eventual focus of reading and understanding develops when your mind is fresh, right? Your concentration and focus are always the best early in the morning. So I'm always a complete adherent of reading and solving things in the morning. You could also look at, and of course, do an analysis of the RCs as well. It's not that you just solve them, but do an analysis as well. You could look at 5 to 10 VA questions every day, along with 2 to 3 RCs. Again, it depends on your time, the schedule that you have. If you are not able to manage 10 VA questions, you can even consider 5. Make it a practice to identify a certain question type and solve 5 questions of that question type. For example, today I plan to do just 5 parajumbles. Tomorrow I wish to take 5 to 10 summary questions, right? Now, please understand that all of these are specific skill sets. And unless I practice them on an everyday basis, I'm not really building on those skill sets. So it's very important that you practice them every now and then. For those who have just begun their preparation, please focus on comprehension. Don't bother about, time-bound testing or so. As of now, it's very important that you give yourself sufficient time to understand an RC and, get the right comprehension. So build on comprehension if you are someone who's just begun your preparation, okay? For people who who get confused with, let's say, a lot of complex reasoning involved. When you come across questions like which of the following, if false, contradict the author's argument, except. Now, that requires multiple levels of reasoning. For that matter, even your regular inferences. I would always encourage you to solve critical reasoning, right? Practice critical reasoning continuously for a matter of 2-3 weeks till you feel very confident looking at complex thought processes like that. So I'd encourage you to solve 5 CR questions every day for some time till you feel that complex reasoning is you are capable of doing that complex reasoning. It could even be that you take difficult CR questions and resolve them. But if you can make this a part of your strategy and solve CR continuously for some time, build your strength there, a lot of question answering and the multiple levels of reasoning required for eliminating options, etc., becomes clearer to you, right? Thank you. Yeah.
Okay. The final question. How many questions should I attempt to get your desired target percentile, right? So for some of us, it is 99 as seen on the chat. For some of us, it is about 80, 85 as of now. So to answer this question, what we'll do is we will refer to the chart. So this tells you the scale score required to hit a particular target percentile, right? So we have looked at 3 years data. Maybe we can look at 21 and 22 in detail because they reflect the current CAT pattern. We're expecting CAT 23 also to have the same number of questions. So a good number would be about, to start with, is about, let's say 80, 85 percentile. I will work with 85 percentile because typically the sectional cutoff at some of the IMS is set at about 85 percentile for their general category students, right? So last year you needed a score of 20. So 7 net answers right to score an 85 percentile. And if you look at the numbers, it arranges in a very beautiful number. So 14 gets you a 70 percentile. You get one more answer right. You jump to the 80 percentile mark. You get one more answer right. You jump to the 85 percentile mark, so on and so forth, right? So one question and you jump up by roughly 5 percentile, at least till the 95 percentile mark, I would say. At least to the 90 percentile mark. After that, it's a jump of 2 questions, right? Now, the second part to it is, what is your accuracy, right? We had done a very detailed study last year that up till the 80 percentile mark, students tend to have a accuracy of about 65 to 70%. At the higher numbers, which is about 95 percentile onwards, the accuracy jumps to about 75%, right? So I'm just going to work with an accuracy number of about 75%, which means suppose I attempt about 15 questions, I'm going to get 12 of them right. So 12 into 3 is going to be 36, right? I'm assuming all the 3 questions that went wrong were with a -1. So then your score comes to 33, right? So with this attempt pattern, 15 attempts and 3 questions wrong, I'm going to be at a score of about 33, which is somewhere around the 96, 97 percentile mark, right? So I will know through my attempts at SimCATs that what should be my desired number of attempts and, with my desired accuracy. Now, suppose right now you are just starting off or verbal is currently not your forte and you are somewhere around the 40, 50, 60 percentile mark. I would say start small and gradually build up, right? So if you're at a 60 percentile right now, please do not pressurize yourself by saying, okay, on the next SimCAT, I need to touch a 99 percentile. That's going to be too much of pressure on you. So I would say, look at, okay, I'm at 70 percentile now, which is a score of about 14. I need to reach an 85 percentile mark, which is, let's say, a score of 20. So how do I get 2 more answers right? So can I, for example, if I have to score 20, can I attempt 10 questions, right? So 2 RCs, I identify the 2 RCs, the 2 easiest RCs, the way Kumudam explained. I may not attempt all of them. I may attempt only 6 or 7 of the 8 questions. And let me, attempt 3 or 4 of the VA questions. So that's my basic strategy. So I attempt 10 questions. I'm working on an accuracy level of, let's say, 70%. So I just get 7 of them right. So 7 into 3, 21, minus 3, which is 18. So with this attempt of 10 questions, I'm going to be at closer to 80 percentile and not to at 85 percentile. So let me say, now I'm saying, okay, let me try 12 questions. So I attempt 12 questions, right? Maybe 2.5 passages or 2 passages completely and 4 or 5 VA questions, right? And I get 75% of them right or 70% of them right. I will touch the 85 percentile mark, So now suddenly I'm not looking at solving 24 questions. I'm looking to solve only 12 or half the number of questions to reach the 85 percentile mark, right? This is for people at who are aiming to reach the cutoff of 85 percentile. Now, suppose some of you are doing really well. You are already at the 92, 95 percentile mark. You would see that to really improve, to go to the 99 percentile mark, the key difference is the number of attempts, because at such levels, the accuracy tends to be very similar. the difference comes to be the number of attempts. So here, maybe you will have to look at attempting about 20 questions with about 75-80% accuracy. And obviously for that 100 percentile mark, I've seen people attempt almost all questions, or if not all, at least 22 of the 24 questions, right? So it is two factors, which is your, the number of attempts you set for yourself and the accuracy. Now, just a word of caution here. Yes, when you read too much and too fast rather, and you attempt recklessly, which means your attempts go very high, your accuracy will obviously suffer. But please remember, there is not a perfect correlation between speed and accuracy, which means suppose I'm reading at 400 words right now or 300 words per minute. Just because I go to 400 words per minute does not mean my accuracy is going to drop by 25%. That does not happen. So please read at the right speed, at a speed where you understand what you're reading. Suppose I just go through a sentence, I've understood nothing, which means I'm going too fast. But if I go through a sentence slightly slowly, but I'm ensuring that I understand every word, I'm reading at the right speed, So keep these factors in mind and keep this data as a guiding principle. The numbers might slightly change next year depending upon the difficulty level of the section. So you'll see that from 21 to 22, there's been a drop in the score required to hit the same percentile because CAT 22 was slightly more difficult as compared to CAT 21. I'm talking about the verbal section here, right? But these numbers hold consistent or give you a good idea of where you should be aiming, right? So I would suggest for your next SimCAT, have a number like, look, I am trying to attempt 12 questions with 70% accuracy so that I can reach the 80 percentile mark. That will give you confidence once you are able to successfully execute your plans. So that is from my side. If one of you needs to add to it, Vijita ma'am, you can add to the same.
Just one thing before, I guess we'll have to wrap up soon. See, everyone takes the same path to that you will probably reach at a different time. So again, this is just to repeat what we have been saying. All right. So this is just to repeat what we have been saying. If you are currently at a 70 percentile, try to make the jump to an 80, right? Because that's going to be pretty simple. It's a matter of 1 or 2 questions. So don't compare yourself with where other people are or what they are doing. That will not necessarily help you. So yes, the test is relative, but the preparation is not necessarily relative, right? So if you've just started, look at where you are today and try to look for small increments. And just remember, every question counts. Vijita ma'am, any other parting words?
No, I think we've covered at least these questions. Do we need to look at any of the questions of students in the chat box? Are there?
I think, Vijita ma'am, most of these questions are answered.
Have been covered, isn't it? Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
Most of it has been covered. So I guess we can stop here. Thank you all for joining us. We had I think a good, terrific time talking to all of you. As mentors, we always enjoy, talking to students, especially with, I think, the most common question that everybody asking us. So, yes, wishing you all the best for your prep. Stay focused. Do spend enough time on your CAT prep for the next 120 odd days that remain. And I think we're looking forward to see you. So tomorrow and after tomorrow, we tackle the other 2 sections. Tomorrow we do DLR exactly 7:30, and therefore we do quant. Right. So hope to see you for these 2 days also. Good evening, and thank you, Vijita ma'am. Thank you, Kubud ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you
for joining us.
Thank you. I had a good time too. And please stay motivated, all of you. Stay focused, stay motivated. All the best.
All the best. Good night, everyone.